In 1995, Hell's Angel adopted 3 black girls. 30 years later, they showed up at his house. The rumble of Frank's Harley-Davidson thundered through the quiet suburban street, drawing curious glances from behind curtained windows. His massive frame, covered in leather and tattoos, cast an intimidating shadow as he pulled up to the foster home. The peeling paint and overgrown lawn told a story of neglect before he even stepped inside. Frank switched off his bike and took a deep breath. The social worker, Ms. Thompson, had called him out of the blue. She'd heard about his volunteer work at the local youth center, a secret he kept from his Hell's Angels brothers. "These girls need someone strong," she'd said. "Someone who won't give up on them." The front door creaked as Frank approached. A thin woman with tired eyes answered his knock. "You must be Mr. McAllister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The girls are inside." The interior of the house smelled of mildew and old cigarettes. Frank's boots felt heavy on the worn carpet as he followed the woman down a narrow hallway. Family photos hung crooked on the walls, none featuring the 3 sisters he'd come to meet. "They're in here," the woman said, gesturing to a small room. "Try not to startle them. They've been through enough. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. Frank ducked his head to enter the room, immediately aware of how his size filled the tiny space. 3 pairs of eyes looked up at him, worried, watchful, and wary. Jasmine, the oldest, sat protectively between her younger sisters. Her chin was lifted slightly, showing a strength that touched something deep inside Frank's chest. Michelle, the middle child, pressed close to Jasmine's side, while little Tasha clutched a worn teddy bear. "Hi there," Frank said softly, trying to make his voice gentler than his appearance suggested. He lowered himself onto a small chair, which groaned under his weight. "I'm Frank." Jasmine's eyes never left his face. "Are you here to split us up?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Frank's heart clenched. He'd seen that look before, in his own reflection as a child, when his family had fallen apart. "No," he said firmly. "That's not why I'm here." Michelle spoke up then, her voice small but clear. "Everyone wants to split us up. They say we're too much trouble together." Frank leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Well, they're wrong about that. Family should stick together." Little Tasha peeked out from behind her teddy bear. "Are you a bad guy? Miss Karen says men with tattoos are bad guys." A smile tugged at Frank's lips. "I might look scary," he admitted, "but looks can be deceiving. Sometimes the toughest-looking people have the softest hearts." Jasmine's expression changed slightly, a flicker of hope breaking through her protective mask. "Why are you really here?" she asked. Frank took another deep breath. His brothers in the club would never understand this moment. But looking at these 3 girls, he saw something he recognized: the need for someone to fight for them, to protect them, to love them. "I'm here because someone told me you needed help," he said honestly, "and I think maybe I need help too. Sometimes being alone isn't the answer." The room fell quiet. In that silence, Frank could hear his own heartbeat, feel the weight of this moment. These girls needed more than just another foster home. They needed someone who would stand between them and the world's cruelty. Someone who wouldn't back down when things got tough. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Marcus Thompson's law office, casting harsh shadows across the mahogany desk where Frank sat. His large hands, calloused from years of working on motorcycles, looked out of place holding the fancy silver pen Marcus had given him. "Just sign here, here, and initial here," Marcus said, pointing to various spots on the documents. The lawyer's tie was loosened, and his sleeves rolled up after hours of going through paperwork. Frank stared at the papers, his heart pounding harder than it did during any bar fight. This was different from anything he'd done before. Fighting? Easy. Making deals with rival gangs? No problem. But becoming a father to 3 young girls? His hand trembled slightly. "You okay, Big Red?" Marcus asked, using Frank's road name. They'd known each other since high school, before Marcus went straight and became a lawyer. "You're looking a little pale there." Frank cleared his throat. "Just never thought I'd be doing something like this." He gestured at the adoption papers. "Me? A father? The guys at the club are going to think I've lost my mind." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. "Maybe you have, but I've known you long enough to know when you're sure about something. And those girls? You're sure about them." The truth of those words hit Frank hard. He was sure. From the moment he'd seen them in that dingy foster home, something had clicked into place, something he didn't even know was missing. "What if I mess this up?" Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I'm not cut out for this father stuff?" Marcus smiled. "You remember when you taught me to ride? I was terrified, but you didn't give up on me. Said everyone falls, but it's getting back up that matters." Frank nodded, remembering those days. He'd been patient then, teaching Marcus the ins and outs of motorcycle maintenance, how to handle the bike in any weather. "Being a father isn't so different," Marcus continued. "You'll make mistakes, but those girls need someone who won't give up on them, someone who'll always get back up." Taking a deep breath, Frank picked up the pen. His signature looked rough next to Marcus's neat lawyer handwriting, but it was done. Page after page, he signed his name, making it official. Marcus gathered the papers, checking each one carefully. "Well, Big Red," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "Congratulations. You're officially a father." Frank stood, his chair scraping against the floor. His hand engulfed Marcus's in a firm handshake. "Everything's set," Marcus assured him. "The girls are legally yours now. The paperwork will be filed first thing in the morning." A mix of emotions washed over Frank. Joy, terror, excitement, doubt. His chest felt tight, like the time he'd wrapped his bike around a tree, but somehow better. Different. He walked to the office door, his boots heavy on the carpeted floor. The evening sun streaming through the windows caught his leather vest, making the Hell's Angels patches gleam. "Hey, Frank," Marcus called after him. "You've got this." Frank nodded, unable to speak. He stepped out into the hallway, his mind racing with thoughts of bedtime stories, school lunches, and everything else he'd need to learn. He didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing. Those girls would never feel unwanted again. Not on his watch. Frank's key rattled in the lock of his 2-story house on Cedar Street. The place suddenly felt different, bigger, emptier somehow, despite being filled with his collection of motorcycle memorabilia and leather jackets. 3 pairs of small feet shuffled behind him as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. "Well, this is home," he said, his gruff voice echoing in the entryway. The girls, Jasmine, Michelle, and Tasha, stood close together, their few belongings clutched in plastic garbage bags. Their eyes darted around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Come on," Frank said, trying to soften his tone. "Let me show you your rooms." He led them up the creaking stairs, past walls lined with framed photos of motorcycles and rally posters. The girls followed silently, their shoes making soft tapping sounds on the wooden steps. Upstairs, Frank pushed open 3 doors. "These are your rooms. Never had much use for them before, but—" He trailed off, watching their faces. The rooms were plain, just beds with fresh sheets and empty dressers, but they were clean and bright. Jasmine, the oldest at 10, was the first to step forward. She peeked into the first room, then turned to her sisters. "Tasha, you take this one. It's closest to the bathroom." Her protective instinct made Frank's chest tighten. Michelle, 6 years old, clutched her garbage bag tighter. Can we decorate them?" Frank scratched his beard, surprised by the question. "Sure, kid. Whatever you want." The smile that spread across Michelle's face made his heart skip a beat. They spent the next hour unpacking. Frank watched from the doorways as the girls carefully arranged their meager possessions. Jasmine lined up 3 worn books on her windowsill. Michelle spread a faded purple blanket on her bed. 4-year-old Tasha hugged a raggedy stuffed rabbit close as she explored her new space. In the kitchen later, Frank's heated up some canned soup and made grilled cheese sandwiches, one of the few meals he knew how to cook. The girls sat at his large kitchen table, their feet dangling from chairs that were too big for them. They ate quietly, stealing glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking. When bedtime came, Frank felt completely out of his depth. But something inside him, some instinct he didn't know he had, took over. He helped Tasha brush her teeth, made sure Michelle had her favorite pajamas on, and watched as Jasmine braided her sister's hair with practiced hands. One by one, he tucked them into their beds. In Tasha's room, he pulled the covers up to her chin, making sure her rabbit was secure in her arms. In Michelle's room, he adjusted her nightlight until she nodded approval. In Jasmine's room, he paused, seeing the worry in her young eyes. "Listen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know this is different. New, maybe even scary, but I want you to know something." He took a deep breath, looking at each girl in turn. "I'm going to protect you. Always. No matter what. You're safe here." The words felt strange coming from his mouth, but he meant every one of them. Jasmine's eyes welled up with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. After saying goodnight to each girl, Frank closed the last door and stood in the hallway. The weight of what he'd just committed to hit him like a physical force. 3 young lives were now in his hands, 3 hearts to protect, 3 futures to guide. He leaned against the wall, his legs feeling weak beneath him. The responsibility was overwhelming, but somewhere deep inside, he knew this was right. The neon beer signs cast a dim glow across the worn wooden bar at the Iron Horse. Frank sat on his usual stool, nursing a bottle of beer while his Hells Angels brothers lounged around him. The familiar smell of cigarette smoke and leather hung heavy in the air. It was different being here now. His mind kept drifting back to the 3 little girls he'd left at home with a babysitter. "So, Big Red's gone domestic on us," Snake, a weathered biker with gray-streaked hair, said with a smirk. He took a long drag from his cigarette, blowing smoke rings toward the ceiling. "Never thought I'd see the day." Frank's fingers tightened around his beer bottle. He'd known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "Just doing what needs to be done," he said gruffly. "What needs to be done?" Razor barked out a laugh. "Since when does that include playing daddy to 3 little girls?" He leaned forward, his chains jingling against the bar. "You're one of our best, Red. Our enforcer. How are you going to handle business with 3 kids at home?" The others murmured in agreement. Frank could feel their eyes on him, judging, questioning. These were men he'd ridden with for years, brothers he'd fought beside and bled with. But right now, they felt like strangers. "Those girls needed someone," Frank said, his voice low but firm. "I stepped up. That's all there is to it." "That's all there is to it?" Tank, a massive man with tattoos covering his neck, shook his head. "You've gone soft, brother. What happens when we need you for a run? When things get rough? You gonna be changing diapers instead of having our backs?" The bar seemed to grow quieter, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Frank set his beer down slowly, deliberately. He could feel the anger building in his chest, not the hot rage he was used to, but something different, protective, fierce. "Listen here," he growled, turning to face his brothers. "Those girls, they're mine now, and yeah, I'm their father, but don't you dare think that makes me soft." His voice carried across the bar, making a few patrons glance nervously in their direction. "I'm still the same man who's ridden with you for 15 years, still the same man who's bled for this club." Snake opened his mouth to speak, but Frank cut him off. "No, you listen. You don't get to question my loyalty. Not to the club, and sure as hell not to my daughters." He stood up, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the bar. "I can be both. I will be both. And if any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me personally." The challenge hung in the air. Frank's brothers shifted uncomfortably, knowing full well what he was capable of. He'd earned his reputation through years of proving himself, and that hadn't changed. "Stay out of it," Frank continued, his voice deadly calm. "Those girls are off limits. I'm still your brother, still a Hell's Angel through and through. But if anyone tries to come between me and my daughters—" He paused, making eye contact with each man at the bar. "They'll learn real quick that being a father hasn't made me any less dangerous." The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty garage windows, casting long shadows across Frank's workspace. He bent over his Harley, wrench in hand, carefully adjusting the engine bolts. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal filled the air, bringing him comfort in its familiarity. This was his element, somewhere he knew exactly what to do and how to do it. A small creak of the garage door caught his attention. Frank looked up to see Jasmine standing in the doorway, her thin frame hesitant against the bright afternoon light. She wore the new yellow dress he'd bought her, but her posture was guarded, arms wrapped around herself like a shield. Frank straightened up, wiping his greasy hands on an old rag. "Hey there," he said, trying to keep his voice soft. It had been 3 weeks since the girls moved in, and Jasmine had barely spoken more than a few words. She didn't respond immediately, just watched him with those observant eyes of hers. Frank shifted his weight, uncertain. He was used to commanding respect, to people moving out of his way when he walked into a room. But this was different. This quiet 10-year-old girl made him feel more nervous than any rival biker ever had. "What are you working on?" Jasmine's voice was barely above a whisper. Frank gestured to the motorcycle. "Just doing some maintenance. Gotta keep her running smooth." He paused, then added, "Want to take a look?" Jasmine took a tentative step forward, then another. Frank held his breath, not wanting to scare her away. She reminded him of a sparrow, ready to take flight at the slightest sudden movement. "Is it hard?" she asked, now close enough to see the array of tools spread across his workbench. "Nah, not once you know what you're doing." Frank picked up a clean rag and held it out to her. "Want to learn how to clean her up?" Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. She reached for the rag, her small hand barely visible as she gripped it. Frank showed her how to apply the polish, demonstrating on a small section of the chrome. "Like this?" she asked, carefully mimicking his movements on the fender. "That's perfect," Frank said, watching her work. "You've got a steady hand." A tiny smile flickered across Jasmine's face, the first he'd seen since she arrived. She continued polishing, her movements becoming more confident. "I used to help fix things sometimes," she said quietly, eyes fixed on her work. "At the other houses, but nobody ever showed me how. They just made me hold tools and yelled when I did it wrong." Frank's jaw tightened at her words, but he kept his voice calm. "Well, that's not how we do things here. If you want to learn, I'll teach you proper." Jasmine's hand paused. "Really?" "Really," Frank confirmed. "No yelling, promise." She looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time, "Nobody's ever promised me anything before," she said softly. "Not and meant it?" Frank knelt down to her level, careful to move slowly. "Listen, Jasmine. I know this is all new, for you and for me, but I meant what I said when I brought you girls home. You're family now, and family takes care of each other." Jasmine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "The last family I had, they hurt us, made us feel like we weren't worth anything." Frank stood in the doorway of Justice, a children's clothing store filled with sparkles and bright colors. He felt like a dark cloud in a rainbow, his leather vest and tattoos drawing nervous glances from other shoppers. But the excited faces of his girls made him square his shoulders and step inside. "Remember, get whatever you need for school," he said, trying to sound casual, despite feeling completely out of his element. Tasha, the youngest, immediately gravitated toward a rack of pink dresses, her small hands touching the fabric with wonder. Michelle wandered over to the shoes, while Jasmine lingered close to Frank, still hesitant to explore. A saleswoman approached them, her smile faltering slightly at Frank's appearance. "Can I help you find anything?" "Yeah," Frank replied, his voice gruff but polite. "The girls need school, clothes, everything, from socks to jackets." The saleswoman's expression softened as she watched Tasha twirling with a dress held against her. "Of course, let's start with sizing them properly." For the next hour, Frank sat on a tiny chair outside the fitting rooms, watching as his daughters tried on outfit after outfit. Each time one of them emerged, they looked to him for approval. He nodded encouragingly, even though he knew nothing about fashion. "Does this look okay?" Michelle asked, modeling a purple sweater and jeans. "Looks great, kiddo," Frank said, meaning it. He'd never seen her look so confident. Tasha came bouncing out in a flowery dress with matching hair clips. "Look, Daddy, it has pockets!" Frank's heart skipped a beat at the word Daddy. It was the first time any of them had called him that. He cleared his throat, trying to hide how much it affected him. "Very nice, sweetheart. Those pockets will be perfect for holding your crayons." After clothes, they headed to the school supply store. Frank watched as the girls selected notebooks, pencils, and backpacks. Tasha chose one covered in unicorns, while Michelle picked a solid blue one. Jasmine selected a simple black backpack, but Frank noticed her eyeing a purple one with stars. "Get the one you really want," he said quietly to her. "It's okay to like pretty things." Jasmine hesitated, then switched the backpacks, a small smile playing on her lips. That evening, Frank sat at their kitchen table, watching his daughters settle into their new routine. The house that had once felt too big and empty now hummed with life. Tasha sat cross-legged on the floor, her new box of crayons spread around her as she drew pictures of their day. Michelle had pulled her chair close to the window, softly humming a tune she'd picked up at school while organizing her new pencil case. The table was set with mismatched plates. They still needed proper dishes, but nobody seemed to mind. Frank had managed to cook spaghetti without burning it, and the smell of garlic bread filled the kitchen. As he watched his daughters, he realized the house felt different now, warmer, like a home. Tasha held up her drawing proudly. "Look, it's all of us shopping." In her childish scrawl, she'd drawn 4 figures, 3 small ones, and 1 very large one in black. Despite the simple style, Frank could see she'd carefully included his tattoos, drawn as colorful swirls on the big figure's arms. Michelle's humming grew a bit louder, her feet swinging under her chair in time with the melody. The sound mixed with the scratch of Tasha's crayons and the quiet contentment of Jasmine setting the table, creating a symphony of domestic peace Frank had never known he wanted. Frank pulled his motorcycle into the driveway, the engine's rumble echoing off the garage door. The setting sun cast long shadows across the front yard, where the girls had left their bikes scattered on the lawn. He smiled, remembering how just that morning, Tasha had finally mastered riding without training wheels. The house was quiet. The girls were at their after-school activities. Michelle had soccer practice, Jasmine was at debate club, and Tasha was at her art class. Frank had arranged his work schedule at the auto shop to make sure he could pick them all up later. He grabbed the mail from the box, thumbing through bills and advertisements as he walked inside. A cream-colored envelope caught his eye. The paper was thick and expensive-looking, with an embossed return address from Harris & Associates, attorneys at law. Frank's weathered hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. The letter inside was printed on heavy stationery, the kind used by people who had more money than they knew what to do with. "Dear Mr. McAllister," the letter began. Frank's eyes scanned the formal language, his jaw tightening with each line. "It has come to my attention that you have somehow gained custody of my granddaughters, Jasmine, Michelle, and Tasha Williams. I am their maternal grandmother, Olivia Harris, and I was unaware of their whereabouts until recently. The fact that they were adopted without my knowledge or consent is unconscionable." Frank's hands gripped the paper harder, creating creases in the pristine surface. The words seemed to blur together as his anger rose. "Let me be clear. These girls belong with their biological family. They deserve the advantages that their heritage and my resources can provide. Your adoption of them, while perhaps well-intentioned, was a grave mistake that must be rectified." The kitchen suddenly felt too small. Frank could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the same way it did before a fight. But this wasn't something he could solve with his fists. "My attorneys are prepared to challenge the adoption on multiple grounds. I have the means and the determination to pursue this matter to its fullest extent. I suggest you consider what is truly best for the girls." The letter went on to detail Olivia's credentials, her wealth, her social standing, her connections. Each word was like a knife, attempting to cut away at everything Frank had built with his daughters. The girls should be raised in an environment befitting their status, not in the custody of a... Frank's throat tightened as he read the next words. "A man with your background and associations." The final paragraph was the worst. "I am prepared to make this transition as smooth as possible, provided you cooperate. Otherwise, I will be forced to take more aggressive legal action. I await your response." It was signed in flowing script. Olivia Harris. Frank let the letter fall to the kitchen counter. The room seemed to spin around him as the magnitude of the threat sank in. This woman, this stranger who hadn't been there when the girls needed a home, who hadn't held them through nightmares or celebrated their achievements, was trying to take them away. He stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the letter. His heart sank as he realized the challenge ahead. He'd fought for his family before. Now he was about to fight for them again. Frank sat across from Marcus in the lawyer's dimly lit office. The leather chair creaked under his weight as he shifted uncomfortably. Marcus, his old biker brother turned attorney, looked up from the stack of papers on his desk, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. "I won't sugarcoat this, Frank," Marcus said, taking off his glasses and rubbing his tired eyes. "Olivia Harris isn't playing around. She's hired Blackwood and Associates. They're the biggest family law firm in the state." Frank's fingers dug into the armrests of his chair. "I don't care who she hired. Those are my girls." Marcus leaned forward, his expression grave. "Listen, brother. These lawyers, they're sharks. They specialize in custody battles, and they've got a 90% success rate. Mrs. Harris has given them an unlimited budget." "Money doesn't make you a parent," Frank growled, his voice low and dangerous. "No, it doesn't," Marcus agreed, shuffling through the papers. "But it can make things very difficult. They're going to dig into your past, Frank. Every arrest, every fight, every connection to the angels. They're going to use it all against you." Frank stood up and paced the small office, his heavy boots thudding against the worn carpet. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across his weathered face. "Those girls were in the system for years," Frank said, stopping at the window. "Where was their grandmother then? Where was she when they needed someone?" Marcus sighed heavily. According to her statement, she didn't know they were in foster care. Says their mother kept it from her, and by the time she found out, you had already adopted them. And now she thinks she can just walk in and take them? Frank's fist clenched at his side. After all these years? She's going to argue that she can provide a better life for them, Marcus explained, reading from a document. Private schools, college funds, social connections. She's already set up trust funds for each of them. Frank turned sharply. Better life? Those girls don't need her money. They need love, stability, someone who will always have their backs. I know that, Frank, Marcus said softly. But the court might see things differently. We need to be prepared. Frank nodded slowly, his jaw set with determination. Whatever it takes, Marcus. I'm not losing my daughters. After leaving Marcus's office, Frank drove home in a daze. The house was empty. The girls were at school. He walked through the quiet rooms, touching the small signs of their life together. Tasha's stuffed animals on the couch, Michelle's soccer cleats by the door, Jasmine's books scattered on the kitchen table. He found himself in the garage, his sanctuary. But even here, their presence was everywhere. Tasha's bike, with the sparkly streamers, Michelle's roller skates hanging on a hook, and there, pinned to his toolboard, one of Jasmine's old drawings. Frank carefully unpinned it, holding it in his rough hands. It was from years ago, done in crayon, 3 stick figures with big smiles, holding hands with a much larger figure, wearing what was clearly meant to be his leather jacket. Across the top, in a child's wobbly handwriting, "My family." Sitting on his workbench, Frank stared at the drawing. His chest felt tight, and his vision blurred. These girls weren't just some responsibility he'd taken on. They were his whole world. They had changed him, given him something to live for beyond the brotherhood and the wild life he'd known before. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the kitchen windows as Jasmine walked through the front door. Her backpack felt heavier than usual, weighed down not just by books, but by the whispers she'd heard at school. Frank looked up from where he was fixing the kitchen sink, his wrench pausing mid-turn. "Hey, kiddo," he said, noticing her troubled expression. "Everything okay?" Jasmine dropped her backpack by the counter and slid onto one of the bar stools. She twisted her hands in her lap, something she always did when she was nervous. "Some kids at school were talking today." Frank wiped his hands on a dish towel and gave her his full attention. "What kind of talk?" "They said..." Jasmine's voice wavered. "They said our real grandmother is trying to take us away, that she's rich and important, and she wants us to live with her instead." Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Who told you that?" "Sarah Mitchell. Her mom works at the courthouse." Jasmine looked down at her hands. "She said her mom saw the paperwork. Is it true, Dad?" Frank pulled up a stool next to her, the metal legs scraping against the tile floor. "Yeah, it's true. Your grandmother, Mrs. Harris, she's filed for custody." "What does that mean exactly?" Jasmine asked, though from her tone she already knew. "It means she wants you girls to live with her instead of me." Frank's voice was gentle but firm. Jasmine's shoulders slumped. "Sarah said... She said her mom told her that Mrs. Harris lives in a mansion. That she has servants and drivers and could send us to the best schools? She paused, her voice growing smaller. Maybe that would be better for us? Frank felt like he'd been punched in the gut, but he kept his face neutral. Better how? I don't know, Jasmine said, fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater. Michelle wants to be a doctor, and Tasha talks about art school. Those things cost a lot of money. And sometimes I see how hard you work, how tired you are trying to provide for us. Jasmine, look at me, Frank said, waiting until her eyes met his. Money isn't everything. Sure, I might not be able to give you fancy cars or expensive clothes, but that's not what makes a family. But what if? No what ifs, Frank interrupted gently. Remember when you had that nightmare last month? Who sat with you until you fell back asleep? You did. And when Michelle was sick with the flu, who stayed up for 3 nights straight to make sure her fever didn't spike? A small smile touched Jasmine's lips. You did. And when Tasha was scared to ride her bike without training wheels, who ran alongside her until she got it? You did, Jasmine whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Frank reached out and took her hand in his large, calloused one. You're my daughter, Jasmine. You and your sisters. You're my whole world. No amount of money can buy that kind of love. No mansion can replace the memories we've made in this house. Jasmine squeezed his hand, but he could still see uncertainty in her eyes. What if she tries to take us away? Then we'll fight, Frank said firmly. I'm your father, and nothing, not money, not fancy lawyers, not anything, is going to change that. You understand? Jasmine nodded slowly, but Frank could tell she wasn't completely convinced. The shadow of doubt still lingered in her eyes, even as she leaned forward to hug him. The mahogany-paneled courtroom felt suffocating as Frank adjusted his borrowed tie. He'd never worn one before, but Marcus had insisted it would help his image. Across the aisle, Olivia Harris sat perfectly poised in an expensive silk suit, her silver hair styled immaculately. Her legal team surrounded her like an army, their briefcases packed with documents and arguments against him. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he watched the court clerk organizing papers. He tucked them under the table, not wanting anyone to see his nervousness. Marcus, his old biker brother turned lawyer, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. All rise, the bailiff called out, as Judge Henderson entered the courtroom. Olivia's lead attorney, Mr. Patterson, approached the bench first. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he presented their case. Your Honor, Mrs. Harris can provide these girls with opportunities Mr. McAllister simply cannot match. Private education, cultural experiences, connections that will benefit them throughout their lives. Patterson gestured toward Frank. While Mr. McAllister's intentions may be admirable, we must consider what's truly best for these children. Mrs. Harris can offer them stability, financial security, and a connection to their heritage. Frank's jaw clenched as Patterson continued listing Olivia's qualifications. The private tutors she'd already arranged, the trust funds she'd set up, the European vacations she had planned. Each word felt like another brick in a wall between him and his daughters. When it was Marcus's turn, he stood tall, despite his weathered leather jacket. Your Honor, Frank McAllister may not have Mrs. Harris's wealth, but he has something far more valuable: 7 years of unwavering dedication to these girls. Marcus pulled out a stack of report cards. Under Frank's care, all 3 girls have maintained excellent grades. They're involved in community service. They're thriving. He paused, looking directly at the judge. Frank has worked 2 jobs to provide for them. He's never missed a parent-teacher conference. He's created a stable, loving home. Olivia's team quickly countered. They projected photographs of Frank's motorcycle club onto a screen, highlighting his past associations. They quoted his old arrest record from his younger days. They presented spreadsheets comparing his modest income to Olivia's millions. "Your Honor," Patterson said smoothly, "can we really allow these children to remain in an environment where they're exposed to elements like this?" He waved toward Frank's tattoos, visible even under his dress shirt. Frank felt his face burning. He wanted to stand up, to defend himself, to tell them about the nights he'd spent reading bedtime stories, the weekends teaching the girls to ride bikes, the proud moments watching them grow. But Marcus had warned him to stay quiet, to let the legal process work. Judge Henderson listened intently, taking notes as both sides presented their arguments. After 2 hours of testimony, she looked up from her bench. "This is a complex case that requires careful consideration. I'm ordering both parties to return next week for continued proceedings. Court is adjourned." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room. Frank watched as Olivia gathered her things, her team of lawyers already discussing their next strategy. She caught his eye for a moment, her expression cold and determined. Outside the courtroom, Frank leaned against the marble wall, loosening his tie. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as people filtered past him. Marcus was talking about their next steps, about character witnesses they could call, but Frank barely heard him. All he could think about was the possibility of losing his girls. The thought of their empty bedrooms, their silent chairs at the dinner table, their missing laughter in the hallways. It was almost too much to bear. He closed his eyes, wondering if love alone would be enough to keep his family together. Frank sat at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold as he watched his daughters pick at their dinner. The weight of the day's court proceedings hung heavy in the air. Tasha pushed her peas around her plate, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a worried frown. "Daddy?" Tasha's small voice broke the silence. "Why do they want to take us away?" Frank's heart clenched. He set down his cup and pushed back from the table, opening his arms. Tasha immediately climbed into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. Michelle and Jasmine watched, their own meals forgotten. "Nobody's taking you anywhere, sweetheart," Frank said, his voice gentle but firm. He stroked Tasha's hair, noticing how she trembled slightly. "Your grandmother. She thinks she can give you things I can't." "Like what?" Michelle asked, her fork hanging suspended over her plate. Frank took a deep breath. "Well, fancy schools, big houses, expensive clothes." He trailed off, seeing the confusion in their eyes. These were his girls. They'd never cared about material things. "But we already have everything we need," Tasha protested, pulling back to look at Frank's face. Her eyes were wide with worry. "We have you." Jasmine stood up and started clearing the plates, her movements sharp and agitated. "It's not that simple, Tasha. Mrs. Harris has money, influence. The judge might think—" "The judge doesn't know us," Frank interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "She doesn't know how we spend Sunday mornings making pancakes together, or how we fix up old bikes for kids who can't afford new ones." Michelle moved closer, leaning against Frank's shoulder. "What if they make us go with her? What if we don't have a choice?" Frank pulled Michelle into a one-armed hug, still holding Tasha with his other arm. "Listen to me, all of you. There's always a choice. And I'm choosing to fight for you. I've never backed down from a fight in my life, and I'm not about to start now." Jasmine paused at the sink, her back turned to them. "But what if fighting isn't enough?" Frank gently set Tasha down and walked over to Jasmine. He placed his hands on her shoulders, turning her to face him. "Look at me, baby girl. Remember when you first came here? Remember how scared you were?" Jasmine nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I promised you then that I'd always protect you. That promise hasn't changed. Not one bit." Later that night, Frank made his usual rounds, tucking each girl into bed. He saved Jasmine for last, knowing she carried the heaviest burden of understanding what was at stake. He sat on the edge of her bed, taking her hand in his. The moonlight filtered through her window, casting soft shadows across her worried face. "Family doesn't come from blood," Frank said softly, squeezing her hand. "It's made of love." Jasmine smiled softly, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. She squeezed his hand back, holding on to the comfort of his words, even as doubts about their future swirled in her mind. The phone rang early Saturday morning while Frank was making breakfast. Jasmine picked it up in the hallway, her hello echoing through the quiet house. "Jasmine, darling, this is your grandmother, Olivia Harris." Jasmine's hand tightened on the receiver. She glanced toward the kitchen where Frank was humming off-key, the smell of bacon filling the air. "I shouldn't be talking to you," Jasmine whispered, moving further down the hallway. "Please just listen." Olivia's voice was smooth as silk. "I want you to understand what I can offer you. Private schools, college funds, summer homes in Europe, the finest clothes, the best opportunities." Jasmine leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. "I don't need those things." "But you deserve them, darling. Look at where you're living now, in that rough neighborhood with that man. Is that really the life you want?" The words stung more than Jasmine expected. She thought about her small bedroom, the second-hand clothes, the whispers at school about her biker dad. "Frank loves us," Jasmine defended, but her voice wavered. "Love isn't always enough, dear. Don't you want more? Don't your sisters deserve more?" After hanging up, Jasmine stood in the hallway, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. The sound of Frank's boots on the kitchen floor brought her back to reality. "Breakfast is ready," Frank called out. "Better hurry before Michelle eats all the bacon again." Jasmine walked into the kitchen, her steps heavy. Frank was at the stove, wearing his old kiss the cook apron over his leather vest. The sight that usually made her smile now filled her with uncertainty. "Dad?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Can we talk?" Frank turned, spatula in hand, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong, baby girl?" Grandmother Harris called. Jasmine watched Frank's face darken. She talked about all the things she could give us: good schools, nice clothes, better opportunities. Frank set the spatula down slowly, his jaw tightening. "I see." "Dad." Jasmine's eyes filled with tears. "Do you think we deserve better than what you've been able to give us?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing. Frank's hands gripped the counter, his knuckles white. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "What you need most isn't luxury, Jasmine. It's not fancy schools or expensive clothes." He turned to face her fully, his eyes glistening. "What you need is love. That's what I've tried to give you every single day since you came into my life." Jasmine wrapped her arms around herself, torn between the comfort of Frank's words and the lingering doubts Olivia had planted. "I know you love us," she whispered. "But maybe she's right. Maybe love isn't enough." She saw the pain flash across Frank's face, saw how her words had hit him like a physical blow. Her heart ached, but the uncertainty wouldn't leave her. I need time to think." Jasmine turned away, unable to bear the hurt in Frank's eyes any longer. Frank stood motionless in the kitchen, watching his daughter walk away. The weight of her words crushed him, making it hard to breathe. The bacon on the stove began to smoke, but he couldn't move, couldn't think past the fear that he might lose everything he held dear. Jasmine walked slowly through the neighborhood park, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the empty playground. She found her way to the old swing set where she used to spend hours with her sisters when they were younger. The chains creaked as she settled onto the worn rubber seat. Her grandmother's words kept playing in her head like a broken record. Private schools, summer homes, the best opportunities, everything a girl could want, except the one thing she already had: a father who loved her unconditionally. She thought about Frank's face in the kitchen, how the light had seemed to dim in his eyes when she questioned whether his love was enough. The memory made her chest ache. Frank had never promised them wealth or luxury, but he had promised to always be there, to protect them, to love them, and he had kept that promise every single day. Pulling out her phone, Jasmine texted Michelle and Tasha, "Meet me at our old swing set. Important." While she waited, she dragged her feet through the wood chips, remembering how Frank used to push them on these same swings. He'd pretend to be a motorcycle engine, making loud rumbling noises that would have them giggling uncontrollably. Those memories weren't worth all the money in the world. Michelle arrived first, her medical textbook tucked under her arm. "Hey sis, what's up?" Before Jasmine could answer, Tasha came jogging up, slightly out of breath. "Sorry I'm late. Had to finish a paper." The three sisters gathered around the swing set, their familiar meeting spot since childhood. Jasmine told them about Olivia's call and her conversation with Frank. "She offered us everything," Jasmine said quietly. "Private schools, fancy clothes, summer homes." Michelle sat on the swing next to her. "But what about Dad?" "That's just it," Jasmine replied, her voice catching. "She talks like he's not good enough for us. Like everything he's done doesn't matter because he can't give us those things." Tasha leaned against the swing set pole, her young face serious. "Remember when I had that nightmare about the foster home? Dad sat with me all night, telling me stories until I fell asleep. You can't buy that kind of love." Michelle nodded, pushing herself gently on the swing. "And remember when he learned to braid hair just for us? He practiced for weeks on that old doll he bought from the thrift store." "He looked so ridiculous," Jasmine smiled, tears forming in her eyes. "But he never gave up," Tasha added softly. "He never gives up on us." The sisters fell quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about the man who had chosen them, who had changed his entire life to give them a home and a family. "I don't want Olivia's money," Michelle finally said. "I want our dad." "Me too," Tasha agreed immediately. "We belong with Dad." Jasmine felt something settle in her chest, a certainty she hadn't felt since Olivia's call. "You're right, both of you." She stood up from the swing, wiping her eyes. "We already have everything we need. We have each other, and we have Dad." The three sisters hugged tightly, their decision made. They would stay with Frank, the man who had taught them that family wasn't about blood or money. It was about love, sacrifice, and choosing each other every single day. The courtroom's heavy wooden doors creaked open as Frank entered, his boots echoing against the polished floor. His daughters walked beside him, their heads held high despite the whispers that followed them. Jasmine squeezed his hand, a gesture that meant more to him than any words could say. Olivia Harris sat on the opposite side, her expensive silk suit and pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her lawyer, a sharp-featured man in an Italian suit, arranged papers on their table with precise movements. The contrast between the two sides couldn't have been more stark. Wealth and privilege facing off against love and determination. "All rise," the bailiff called out as Judge Thompson entered the courtroom. The rustle of people standing filled the air. Then silence fell as everyone took their seats again. "We're here for the final hearing in the matter of Harris versus McAllister," Judge Thompson announced, his voice firm and neutral. "Mr. Patterson, you may present your closing arguments for Mrs. Harris." Olivia's lawyer rose smoothly, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, this case is about providing these 3 young women with the best possible future. Mrs. Harris can offer them opportunities that Mr. McAllister simply cannot match. Private education, cultural experiences, connections in society. These are advantages that will shape their entire lives. Patterson gestured toward Frank with a carefully practiced look of concern. While Mr. McAllister's intentions may be admirable, we must consider what's truly best for these young women. Mrs. Harris can provide stability, refinement, and a lifestyle that will open doors for them. She is their blood relative, their grandmother, and she has the means to give them everything they deserve. Frank's hands clenched under the table as Patterson continued listing all the material advantages Olivia could provide. Each word felt like a personal attack, but he forced himself to stay calm, remembering what Marcus had told him about keeping his composure in court. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, Frank's old friend and lawyer stood up slowly. Unlike Patterson's polished performance, Marcus spoke with raw honesty. Your Honor, this case isn't about money or social advantages. It's about family, real family. Frank McAllister didn't share blood with these girls when he found them in that foster home, but he shared something more important. He shared his heart. Marcus turned to look at the girls, then back at the judge. For years, Mr. McAllister has been there for every skinned knee, every nightmare, every triumph, and every tear. He learned to braid hair for his daughters. He attended every parent-teacher conference. He worked extra hours to make sure they had everything they needed. Not wanted, needed. The girls nodded, tears in their eyes as Marcus continued. Love isn't measured in dollar signs, Your Honor. It's measured in moments, in sacrifices, in showing up every single day. That's what Frank McAllister has done for these girls. That's what family really means. Judge Thompson listened intently, his expression unreadable as both lawyers finished their arguments. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife as he shuffled through his notes. I'll take a brief recess to review the arguments and evidence before making my decision, Judge Thompson announced. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. Frank stood slowly, his daughters gathering around him. Michelle slipped her hand into his right hand, while Jasmine took his left. Tasha stood close, her shoulder pressing against his arm. Together they formed a tight circle, drawing strength from each other as they waited for the judge's return. They had done everything they could. Now all they could do was hope that their love, their real, messy, imperfect but unconditional love, would be enough to keep their family together. The courthouse hallway felt colder and longer than Frank remembered. He paced back and forth, his boots scuffing against the marble floor, while his daughters sat quietly on a nearby bench. The 30-minute recess stretched out like an eternity. A loud rumble from outside caught his attention. The sound grew stronger, and Frank recognized it immediately. Motorcycles. Lots of them. His heart skipped a beat as he walked to the window. There, pulling into the courthouse parking lot, was a sight he never expected to see. At least 20 Hell's Angels, their bikes gleaming in the afternoon sun, lined up in perfect formation. Leading them was Bull, the chapter president who had been the most vocal critic of Frank's decision to adopt the girls. "What's happening?" Jasmine asked, joining him at the window. Frank shook his head, speechless. He watched as his brothers dismounted their bikes and headed toward the courthouse entrance, their leather vests adorned with patches telling stories of years on the road. Minutes later, the heavy doors swung open, and Bull's massive frame filled the doorway. Behind him, the other angels filed in, their usual intimidating presence somewhat subdued by the formal setting. "Big Red," Bull said, using Frank's old road name. His voice was gruff, but carried an unusual warmth. "We figured you could use some backup." Frank stood straighter, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Bull, Save it," Bull interrupted, stepping closer. "We were wrong about you, brother. Dead wrong." He glanced at the girls, who watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. "These past years, we've seen what you've done for these girls, how you've changed, but stayed true to who you are. That takes more guts than any road battle we've ever fought." The other angels nodded in agreement. Tommy, an old road captain, spoke up. "You showed us what it really means to be loyal, Frank. Not just to the club, but to family." One by one, the angels approached Frank, offering handshakes, hugs, and words of support. The girls watched in amazement as these tough, leather-clad men showed a side of themselves few ever got to see. "Besides," Bull added with a slight grin, "we figure any man who can raise 3 teenage girls single-handed is tougher than all of us put together." A small laugh rippled through the group, breaking the tension. Even the girls giggled, the sound mixing strangely but perfectly with the gruff chuckles of the bikers. Marcus appeared from around the corner, his eyes widening at the sight of so many Hell's Angels in the courthouse hallway. He quickly composed himself and made his way to Frank. "Frank," Marcus said, his voice low and serious. "The judge is ready to make his decision. We need to head back in." The laughter died away, replaced by a heavy silence. Frank felt his heart pound against his ribs as the reality of the moment hit him. Everything they'd been through, every bedtime story, every school play, every tear and triumph, it all came down to what would happen in the next few minutes. Bull placed a heavy hand on Frank's shoulder. "We're right behind you, brother, all of us." Frank looked at his daughters, then at his biker family, and finally at Marcus. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Let's do this." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Henderson cleared his throat. Frank's palms were sweating, and he could feel his heart hammering against his chest. The girls sat beside him, their hands linked together in a chain of sisterly support. Behind them, the rows were filled with leather-clad Hell's Angels, sitting unusually straight and respectful in the formal setting. Across the aisle, Olivia Harris sat perfectly poised, her expensive silk suit without a wrinkle, her face a mask of controlled anticipation. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Henderson began, his voice steady and clear. "This court has reached its decision." He paused, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at his notes. Frank held his breath. The moments stretched like rubber bands about to snap. "The bond between Mr. McAllister and these 3 young women is extraordinary," the judge continued. "While Mrs. Harris offers material advantages, this court recognizes that the emotional well-being of children, or in this case, young adults, cannot be measured in dollars and cents." Olivia's attorney shifted in his chair, but remained silent. "Mr. McAllister has demonstrated, through his actions and dedication over the years, that he is more than capable of providing the love, support, and guidance these young women need. The testimony of the girls themselves has been particularly compelling." The judge turned his gaze directly to Frank. "This court has observed something remarkable here. A family built not on blood or wealth, but on choice, commitment, and unconditional love." Frank squeezed Jasmine's hand as the judge continued. "Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that the adoption stands. The girls will remain with their father, Frank McAllister." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Tasha buried her face in Frank's shoulder, while Michelle wiped tears from her eyes. Jasmine sat perfectly still, but her grip on Frank's hand tightened. "However," the judge added, raising his voice slightly over the murmur that had begun, This court also recognizes Mrs. Harris's genuine desire to be part of her granddaughters' lives. Therefore, reasonable visitation rights will be granted to be arranged through proper channels and with the girl's consent. Olivia's shoulders dropped slightly, but she nodded, accepting the decision with as much grace as she could muster. "Court is adjourned," Judge Henderson announced, bringing down his gavel with a definitive crack. The sound seemed to break a dam within Frank. Everything he'd been holding back, all the fear, worry, and uncertainty, came rushing out. He turned to his daughters, opening his arms wide. The girls didn't hesitate. They crashed into him like waves against a shore, all three at once, creating a tangle of arms and tears and laughter. Frank wrapped them in a bear hug, his large frame enveloping them protectively, just as he had done since the day he first brought them home. "We did it, Dad," Jasmine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're staying together." "Always," Frank managed to say, his voice rough with feeling. "We're family. Nothing's ever going to change that." Michelle and Tasha squeezed tighter, and for a moment the bustling courtroom faded away. There was only this, a father and his daughters, bound together by something stronger than blood or law. The fight was over. Their family was whole. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the hardwood floor. Frank stood at the counter, his large hands wrapped around a steaming coffee mug, watching his daughters bustle around the kitchen. The court battle was behind them now, and a new sense of peace had settled over their home. Jasmine sat at the kitchen table, her law school textbooks spread out before her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes sparkled with determination as she highlighted important passages. She'd always been the serious one, but lately her smile came more easily. Michelle danced around the kitchen, humming to herself as she packed her bag for her pre-med classes. Her medical scrubs were neatly folded, ready for her afternoon shift at the hospital where she volunteered. She'd grown into a confident young woman, her natural warmth drawing people to her. Tasha, the youngest, sat cross-legged on the counter despite Frank's frequent reminders about proper seating. She was sketching in her notebook, her art supplies scattered around her. Her social work courses were helping her understand her own past, and she'd begun to use her art to help other foster kids heal. "Dad," Jasmine called out, looking up from her books. "Did you remember we're having dinner together tonight? No working late on your bikes." Frank nodded, his heart swelling at the word Dad. It still got him, even after all these years. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart." Michelle stopped her dancing long enough to pour herself a cup of coffee. "Remember when we first came here? We were so scared to even ask for seconds at dinner." "And now we can't shut you up," Frank teased, his gruff voice warm with affection. Tasha laughed, adding some final touches to her sketch. "Remember when you tried to make us pancakes that first morning? They were black as tar." "Hey now," Frank protested, but he was grinning. "I got better." "You sure did, Dad," Jasmine said, closing her book. "You got better at everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. They all knew she wasn't just talking about cooking. That evening, they gathered around the dinner table, the same one where they'd shared their first meal together years ago. The girls had insisted on cooking, filling the kitchen with delicious aromas and playful bickering. "Pass the potatoes," Michelle called out, reaching across the table. "Say please," Tasha teased, holding the bowl just out of reach. "Please, oh wise and wonderful sister," Michelle replied, with an exaggerated bow. Jasmine rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. "You two never change." Frank sat back in his chair, taking in the scene before him. The nervous, frightened girls he'd brought home had blossomed into strong, capable women. Jasmine's quiet strength, Michelle's infectious joy and Tasha's gentle spirit had not only survived their difficult start in life, but had grown stronger. As their laughter filled the room, Frank realized something profound. In trying to heal these three little girls, he'd found healing himself. The lonely, angry man he'd been had disappeared, replaced by someone who knew the true meaning of family. "What are you smiling about, Dad?" Tasha asked, noticing his expression. "Just happy," he replied simply, reaching for the potatoes Michelle was still trying to get. "Just really happy." Frank's motorcycle rumbled to a stop in front of the sprawling Harris estate, followed by his daughters in their cars. The iron gates opened slowly, revealing a manicured driveway that wound through perfectly trimmed gardens. It was a far cry from their modest home, with its cluttered garage and worn welcome mat. Jasmine straightened her blazer as she stepped out of her car. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" Frank nodded, his leather jacket creaking as he dismounted his bike. "She's your grandmother, and she's trying." Michelle and Tasha joined them, both looking uncertain. The mansion loomed before them, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. A butler opened the heavy wooden door before they could knock, ushering them into a grand foyer with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Olivia Harris stood at the top of the curved staircase, her silver hair perfectly styled and her outfit immaculate. But something was different about her now. The rigid set of her shoulders had softened, and her eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there during the court battles. "Welcome," she said, descending the stairs. "I'm so glad you came." The girls hung back slightly, instinctively moving closer to Frank. He placed a reassuring hand on Tasha's shoulder, feeling her tension. "Please, come into the sitting room," Olivia gestured. "I've had tea prepared." They followed her into an elegant room filled with antique furniture. Delicate china cups and silver platters of cookies awaited them on a low table. Frank looked comically large in the dainty armchair he chose, but he sat straight and proud. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Olivia began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "About family and what that really means." She looked directly at Frank, her voice steady but humbled. "I didn't understand at first. I thought money and social standing were what mattered most. But watching you with my granddaughters, I was wrong." Frank shifted in his chair, unused to such words from the woman who had fought so hard to take his daughters away. "We all want what's best for them," he said gruffly. "Yes," Olivia agreed. "But what's best isn't always what we think it is. You've given them something I couldn't, unconditional love and acceptance. You've made them strong." She turned to the girls. "And you've become such remarkable young women." Tears welled in Michelle's eyes as she reached for her grandmother's hand. Jasmine's usual composure cracked slightly, and even Tasha managed a small smile. "I'd like to be part of your lives," Olivia continued, "if you'll let me. Not to change anything, but to add to what you already have." Frank watched his daughters' faces, seeing the mix of emotions there. He knew this moment was important for them, acknowledging their past while embracing their present. "We'd like that," Jasmine spoke for all of them, her voice gentle. They spent the next hour sharing stories and cookies, the formal atmosphere gradually relaxing. Olivia listened intently as the girls talked about their studies and dreams, her eyes lighting up with genuine interest and pride. As the afternoon drew to a close, they stood in the foyer saying their goodbyes. Olivia hugged each of her granddaughters, then surprised everyone by extending her hand to Frank. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being the father they needed." Outside, as they walked back to their vehicles, Frank gathered his daughters close. The mansion rose behind them, grand and imposing. but it wasn't home. "You know," he said quietly, "it's okay to love her too. Your heart's big enough for both of us. But home." He paused, looking at each of their faces. "Home is with me." The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Frank's motorcycle rumbled to a stop in front of the Daily Grind Cafe. Tasha sat behind him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her work apron tucked safely in her backpack. Her first real job. The thought made her stomach flutter with butterflies. Frank cut the engine, and the sudden quiet felt heavy with meaning. Tasha climbed off, smoothing down her neat black pants and adjusting her crisp white shirt. Her hands trembled slightly as she fixed her hair, messed up from the helmet. "You look perfect, sweetheart," Frank said, his gruff voice softened by pride. He wasn't wearing his usual leather jacket today. He'd put on a clean denim one instead, not wanting to intimidate anyone on Tasha's first day. "What if I mess up the coffee orders?" Tasha bit her lip, looking at the cafe's cheerful storefront. "Or drop something, or, hey now," Frank interrupted, placing his big hands on her shoulders. "Remember what we talked about?" Tasha took a deep breath. "Take it one step at a time?" "That's right." Frank nodded. "And?" "Be proud of myself," she added, managing a small smile. Through the cafe's windows, they could see the morning crew setting up, wiping tables and arranging pastries in the display case. The smell of fresh coffee drifted out whenever someone opened the door. "You've got this, Tasha," Frank said firmly. "You're stronger than you know. Always have been." Tasha hugged him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and motor oil that always meant safety to her. "Thanks, Dad." Frank watched her walk into the cafe, her shoulders straight despite her nervousness. His heart swelled with pride. His youngest, taking her first steps into the working world. The day passed slowly for Frank. He kept his phone close while working in the garage, checking it more often than he'd admit. Around 2 in the afternoon, it finally rang. "Dad!" Tasha's voice bubbled with excitement. "You won't believe it!" Frank set down his wrench, wiping his hands on a rag. "Tell me everything, sweetheart." "I didn't spill anything, not one drop, and I remembered all the orders, even the complicated ones with extra shots and special milk." The words tumbled out in a rush. "And guess what? My boss, Ms. Martinez, she said I'm a natural with customers. She wants to give me more shifts next week." Frank could hear the joy in her voice, could picture the bright smile on her face. "That's my girl," he said, his throat tight with emotion. "I knew you could do it." "I was so scared this morning," Tasha admitted. "But you were right. I just had to believe in myself." "You've always had it in you," Frank said. "Sometimes you just need someone to remind you." "Thanks, Dad. I better go. My break's almost over. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart." Frank stood in his garage, phone still in hand, a smile spreading across his face. His little Tasha, the shy girl who used to hide behind his legs when strangers came near, was growing into a confident young woman. He couldn't have been prouder. The December air bit cold and crisp as Frank's pickup truck rumbled into Peterson's Christmas tree farm. Jasmine, Michelle, and Tasha pressed their faces against the windows, their breath fogging up the glass as they took in the rows upon rows of evergreens dotting the snowy landscape. "Look at that one." Tasha pointed excitedly at a perfectly shaped tree near the entrance. "It's so pretty." Michelle shook her head. "Too small. We need something bigger for the living room." Frank pulled into a parking spot, killing the engine. He'd never bought a Christmas tree before. His previous holidays had been spent alone, or with his biker brothers at the local bar. But this year was different. This year he had a family to celebrate with. "Remember," he said, turning to face the girls, We all have to agree on the tree. It's our first Christmas together. It needs to be special. They piled out of the truck, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke from the farm's warming station. Holiday music played softly from speakers mounted on wooden poles throughout the lot. "This way!" Jasmine called out, already heading down one of the rows. Her sisters followed, leaving Frank to grab the saw and rope from the truck bed. For the next hour, they wandered through the farm, each girl championing different trees. Tasha loved the perfectly shaped ones. Michelle wanted the tallest she could find, and Jasmine preferred the fuller, wider trees. Frank followed patiently, watching his daughters debate the merits of each potential choice. "What about this one?" Michelle called out, standing beside a massive, slightly crooked tree. It stood at least 9 feet tall, with branches spreading wide in all directions. Some might call it scraggly, with gaps between its branches and a slight lean to one side, but there was something endearing about its imperfect nature. Tasha wrinkled her nose. "It's kind of weird looking." "I think it's perfect," Jasmine said, walking around it. "Look how much space there is for ornaments. And see these branches? They're strong. They'll hold lots of decorations." Frank studied the tree, seeing beyond its flaws to its potential. "Sometimes," he said, "the ones that look a little different turn out to be exactly what we need." The girls exchanged looks, seeming to understand the deeper meaning in his words. They were an unusual family, a former Hell's Angel and 3 adopted girls, but they fit together perfectly. "Can we get it?" Michelle asked, bouncing on her toes with excitement. Frank looked at each of his daughters in turn. "What do you all think?" "Yes," they chorused together, finally in agreement. Frank made quick work of cutting down the tree, his strong arms handling the saw with practiced ease. The girls watched in amazement as he hoisted the massive evergreen onto his shoulder, carrying it to the truck as if it weighed nothing. Back home, they worked together to set up the tree in the corner of the living room. Frank secured it in the stand, while the girls directed him to twist it this way and that, until it stood as straight as its natural lean would allow. Stepping back, they gathered on the couch to admire their choice. The tree filled the room with its fresh pine scent, its wild branches reaching out like welcoming arms. Even without decorations, it already looked like home. Frank sat in the middle of the couch, his daughters cuddled close on either side. Looking at their tree, their first family Christmas tree, he felt something settle in his chest. A warmth, a rightness, a sense of belonging he'd never known before. This was where he was meant to be. Still gathered around their newly chosen Christmas tree, the warm glow of the living room lamps created a cozy atmosphere as evening settled in. Frank brought over mugs of hot chocolate, passing them carefully to each of his daughters. "I got my acceptance letter today," Jasmine said suddenly, her fingers wrapped tightly around her mug. "From law school." Her voice trembled slightly with excitement. Frank's eyes widened. "You didn't tell me you applied." "I wanted to be sure first," she explained, reaching into her back pocket and pulling out a folded letter. "Full scholarship," Michelle squealed, nearly spilling her hot chocolate. "That's amazing, Jazz." "I want to help people who don't have anyone else to fight for them," Jasmine continued, her voice growing stronger. "Like you did for us, Dad." She looked at Frank, her eyes shining. There are so many kids out there who need someone to stand up for them in court. Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He remembered all those years ago standing in that courtroom, fighting to keep his family together. "Well," Michelle piped up, setting her mug down on the coffee table, "since we're sharing news..." She pulled out her phone, showing them her latest test scores. "Top of my pre-med class," My professor says I'm on track for medical school next year." "A doctor?" Tasha's eyes went wide. "That's so cool." "I want to work in pediatrics," Michelle explained, tucking her legs underneath her. "Remember when I was sick as a kid, and you drove me to the emergency room, Dad?" She smiled at the memory. "That doctor was so kind. She made me feel safe. I want to do that for other kids." Frank remembered that night clearly. The fear in his heart when Michelle's fever wouldn't break. The way he'd paced the hospital hallways. He'd never felt so helpless. "What about you, Tosh?" Jasmine asked, turning to their youngest sister. "Still thinking about teaching?" Tasha nodded enthusiastically. "I've been volunteering at the elementary school after my cafe shifts. The kids are amazing." Her face lit up as she talked. "There's this one little girl who reminds me so much of me when I was young. She's shy and scared, but when someone believes in her, she just blooms." Frank watched his youngest daughter gesture animatedly as she described her experiences. She'd come so far from the timid 4-year-old who'd hardly spoken a word when he first met her. "I want to be that person who shows kids they can do anything," Tasha continued. "Like you did for us, Dad. You never gave up on us, even when things got tough." The room fell quiet for a moment, filled only with the soft scent of pine and the warmth of family. Frank looked at each of his daughters, Jasmine with her quiet determination, Michelle with her boundless enthusiasm, and Tasha with her gentle spirit. They'd grown into strong, capable women, each finding their own way to make the world a better place. Pride swelled in his chest as he listened to them share their dreams and plans. These were his girls, no longer the scared, broken children he'd met all those years ago, but confident young women ready to take on the world. They had big dreams, and he knew without a doubt they would achieve them. The rumble of a motorcycle engine cut through the peaceful evening. Frank's head snapped up, recognizing the distinctive sound of a Harley-Davidson Softail, a sound that took him back 20 years. Through the window, he spotted a familiar figure pulling into his driveway. Snake. Thompson, his old road captain from the Hells Angels, dismounted the bike. His leather vest was weathered, patches faded but still visible in the fading light. Frank hadn't seen him in over a decade. "Girls, stay inside," Frank said quietly, moving toward the front door. His daughters exchanged worried glances but nodded. Snake's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached. His face was more lined than Frank remembered, his beard streaked with gray, but his eyes still held that same intensity. "Big Red," Snake called out, using Frank's old road name. "Been a long time, brother." Frank stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "Snake, wasn't expecting to see you." "Passing through town." Snake's eyes swept over the house, taking in the welcome mat, the potted plants, the wind chimes Tasha had made in art class. "Quite a setup you've got here. Different from the old days." Frank's jaw tightened. The old days meant wild nights, bar fights, and choices he'd rather forget. That was another life. "Remember that run to Sturgis in '92? Snake chuckled. "That bar fight in Rapid City? You took on 3 guys yourself. Meanest son of a gun I ever rode with." The memories flooded back. The adrenaline, the violence, the feeling of being untouchable. Frank's hands instinctively clenched into fists, muscle memory from countless brawls. Through the window he caught a glimpse of his daughters watching anxiously. Jasmine stood protectively in front of her sisters, just like she used to when they were little. The sight grounded him. "Things change, Snake," Frank said firmly. "I changed." Snake pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. "Yeah, heard you went straight. Got yourself some kids." He lit up, smoke curling in the evening air. Never thought I'd see Big Red McAllister playing daddy. Those girls saved my life, Frank said quietly. Gave me something worth fighting for. Snake took a long drag, studying Frank's face. You were always different, Red. Even back then, had a conscience. Made you a liability sometimes. Inside, Michelle had moved to the kitchen to start dinner. The smell of garlic and onions drifted out. Tasha was setting the table. Frank could hear the familiar clink of plates. That conscience kept me alive, Frank replied. Kept me from ending up dead or in prison. Snake nodded slowly, flicking ash onto the ground. Club's not the same without you. Some of the old guard still talk about you. That life's behind me now. Frank's voice was firm. I've got responsibilities here. Yeah, I can see that. Snake's eyes softened slightly. You look good, Red. At peace. Never saw that in you before. Through the window, Frank watched Jasmine help Tasha with her homework, while Michelle stirred something on the stove. His heart swelled with pride and love, emotions he'd never known he was capable of before they came into his life. Snake finished his cigarette, crushing it under his boot. Well, just wanted to check in. See how you were doing. He extended his hand. Take care of yourself, brother. Frank shook it, feeling the familiar calluses. You too, Snake. Ride safe. The old biker walked back to his motorcycle, started it up, and rode away into the gathering dusk. Frank stood in the doorway, watching until the taillights disappeared. Behind him, the sounds of his family continued, dishes clinking, his daughter's voices mixing with laughter. This was his life now, and it was worth more than all the wild freedom of his past. Frank sat on the weathered porch steps, his massive frame settled comfortably against the railing. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting long shadows across their front yard. Beside him, his 3 daughters lounged on the wooden deck chairs they'd arranged in a half circle. Remember when we first moved in? Jasmine asked, her voice soft with nostalgia. I was so scared of this big house. Michelle laughed, pulling her knees up to her chest. And Dad had all those motorcycle parts in what became my room. I thought it was some kind of crazy machine shop. It kind of was, Frank chuckled, his deep voice rumbling. He reached out and squeezed Tasha's hand as she sat closest to him. Took me 3 whole weekends to clear everything out. The evening air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden they'd planted together years ago. Frank remembered how tiny Tasha's hands had been when she first helped him dig those holes in the dirt. I used to think you were the scariest person I'd ever seen, Tasha admitted, grinning up at him, with all those tattoos and that big beard. Used to think? Frank raised an eyebrow, trying to look stern but failing as his lips twitched into a smile. Now we know you're just a big teddy bear, Michelle teased, reaching over to pat his arm. The girls laughed, and Frank felt warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sunset. These moments were precious to him. Just sitting here, being together, no court battles or custody, fights hanging over their heads. Snake's visit got me thinking, Jasmine said thoughtfully, about how different things could have been, for all of us. Frank nodded slowly. Life's funny that way. Sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and they all sat quietly for a moment, lost in their own thoughts. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. You know what I remember most about those early days? Michelle asked, her voice soft. How you'd check on us every night before you went to bed, even when you thought we were asleep. Still do, Frank admitted gruffly, feeling a slight blush creep up his neck. We know, all 3 girls said in unison, causing another round of laughter. Tasha leaned her head against Frank's shoulder, just like she used to do when she was little. "I'm glad you found us, Dad." "Me too, sweetheart," Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Me too." The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the clouds in deep purples and reds. Cricket songs filled the air, a peaceful evening symphony. Frank looked at each of his daughters. Jasmine, so strong and protective. Michelle, with her gentle heart and quick wit. And Tasha, still his baby girl despite being all grown up. "You girls changed everything," he said quietly. "Gave me a reason to be better. To do better." "You did the same for us," Jasmine replied, reaching over to squeeze his other hand. They sat together as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, a family forged not by blood, but by love and choice. Frank watched his daughters, these amazing young women who had transformed his life in ways he never could have imagined. His heart felt full to bursting with pride and joy. Frank placed a steaming dish of his famous chili in the center of the dinner table. The spicy aroma filled the kitchen, mixing with the fresh-baked cornbread Tasha had made. His daughters gathered around, passing bowls and sharing knowing smiles. "Dad, remember when you tried to cook for us that first week?" Michelle laughed, spooning chili into her bowl. "I think we had takeout pizza 3 nights in a row." Frank's weathered face crinkled with amusement. "Hey now, I learned pretty quick. Had to, with 3 growing girls to feed." "More like we taught you," Jasmine teased, reaching for the cornbread. "I still remember showing you how to make mac and cheese without burning it." "That was a dark day," Frank admitted, his deep voice warm with humor. "Never lived that one down." Tasha giggled, her eyes bright. "But look at you now, Dad. Your chili's the best in town." The kitchen light cast a warm glow over their faces as they ate together, the comfortable rhythm of spoons against bowls punctuating their conversation. Frank watched his daughters, really seeing them, not just as the little girls he'd rescued all those years ago, but as the strong women they'd become. Jasmine, with her quiet strength and fierce determination, already making waves at her law firm. Michelle, whose gentle heart matched her quick mind as she pursued her medical degree. And Tasha, still so full of light and joy, teaching art to elementary school kids. "You know," Frank said, his voice growing serious, "I never thought I'd have this. A real family." The girls paused, looking at their father with understanding in their eyes. "Neither did we," Jasmine replied softly. "Before you came along, we thought we'd always be alone." Michelle reached across the table and squeezed Frank's massive hand. "We chose each other, Dad. That's what makes it special." "Yeah," Tasha added, her eyes glistening. "It wasn't just chance. We all decided to make this work, even when it was hard." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. He remembered all those nights of uncertainty, the struggles with the courts, the whispers from people who didn't understand. But here they were, stronger for having weathered those storms together. "Remember when the neighbor called social services?" Michelle chuckled. "She thought you were running some kind of biker gang daycare." The table erupted in laughter, the memory now funny rather than painful. "Poor Mrs. Jenkins nearly fainted when she saw your motorcycle club friends helping us build the treehouse," Tasha added, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. "Those guys turned out to be pretty good uncles," Frank smiled, thinking of how his old crew had eventually become extended family. Jasmine raised her glass of iced tea. "To family, the kind you choose." "To family," they all echoed, their glasses clinking together. The sound of their shared laughter filled the kitchen, bouncing off the walls covered in family photos, snapshots of their life together. First days of school, graduations, birthdays, and quiet moments just like this one. Each picture told a story of love, growth, and the unbreakable bonds they'd forged. Frank looked around at his daughters' smiling faces, his heart full. This was what family meant, not blood or obligation, but choice and love. They had chosen each other, fought for each other, and built something beautiful together. The kitchen echoed with their continued laughter and joy, a testament to the family they had become. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story, and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.